So this morning we have a special guest with us, and I don't know if you guys have caught on to this, but I want to bring opportunities of mission to you as a church. We as a church cannot support every ministry and mission that asks for our support corporately. But I do believe that there are different ways that we as individual believers can help support the ministry of God. And so with us this morning is J.D. King, and he knows me through my dad and my grandpa, both is from NCC. But J.D. comes today to share about deaf child hope. And I'm going to let him do the explaining because he does it best. But would you just welcome J.D. this morning with Rockwell City? Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Is this turned on? We're going to have to get the power. I think if you just click on the bottom orange PowerPoint, we'll let Dylan get it there. So good to be with you this morning. I was thinking on the way up, yeah, there we go. I grew up in Council Bluffs, and I went to Nebraska Christian College, so just a little bit about me. And I went there for 2 years, and then I decided to go to the University of Iowa. So all you Cyclone fans, I'm sorry. We still love each other though, right? You still like me? Okay, I'm a Hawkeye. I graduated from Iowa with a business degree, and I graduated from Nebraska Christian College with a 2-year degree in ministry. And then God called me into the ministry. This is a number of years ago, and I decided to go to seminary. So I went to Cincinnati Christian University and got my master's in practical ministries, and I became a youth pastor. I was the associate minister for 1 year at Webster City, Iowa, which is where I met my wife. So she grew up in Webster City. Her grandfather used to make hog feeders. So anybody here have hogs? No. So their hog feeders used to be sold all across the country. He was kind of famous for, being famous for making hog feeders. I think that's okay, isn't it? Anyway, I snagged her from Webster City, and we got married, and we have 3 kids. And my brother-in-law actually grew up close to Pocahontas, so I do have roots in this area. But I was thinking on my way up here, I bet I've been to 40 different churches in Iowa at some time or another. I've been in some singing groups and things of that nature, and I have never been to this church. So it is a pleasure to be with you. Dylan's grandfather, Carl, was my dorm dad at Nebraska Christian College, and I actually went to college with his dad, Tony, for I think a year or two. And my dad, so Tony's at Griswold now, and you guys probably know this, but my dad preached at Griswold for about a year and a half. So we have some connections there. And I have a story about Dylan and Ashley that you guys probably don't know. When they were dating, Dylan wanted to kiss Ashley. Did you guys know this? And he read in the Bible, it doesn't say anywhere in the Bible that I can kiss her, as while we're dating. And he looked for scriptures, couldn't find a scripture that allowed him to date Ashley. And she was kind of upset about this, One day after a date, went to a movie, they got to the porch. He walked her to the porch, and she took him and she slammed him up against the wall, and she laid this luscious kiss on his lips. And he was so upset about it. How could you do this to me? Scripture verse, tell me. And she said, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. That's a totally not true story, but on their anniversary, I thought I would share that with you. So anyway, thank you for having me here today. You probably have never heard of Deaf Child Hope International. How many of here have heard of Deaf Missions? Anybody heard of Deaf Missions? Okay. So my father started Deaf Missions when I was in Griswold about that time, and then he moved to Council Bluffs. He was traveling to Iowa School for the Deaf when he was the senior pastor at Griswold, teaching the deaf students at Iowa School for the Deaf Bible classes. And God put upon his heart to minister to deaf people. Well, Deaf Missions reaches all over the globe now with deaf ministry. So if you know of Deaf Missions, you'd say, oh, it makes sense that JD's working with deaf children. To be honest with you, I had no idea that I'd be doing this. Okay? I had no desire when I was young to be in deaf ministry whatsoever. Now, I believed in what my dad was doing, and I mowed the lawn at Deaf Missions when I was young. I pushed the snow. I'd get up before school and get on the Alice Chalmers 16-horse tractor and clear the snow of the parking lot of Deaf Missions when I was a kid, but I had no desire to serve in deaf ministry. And then guess what happened? God grabbed my heart about 10 years ago now, probably about 12 years ago, and I'll spare you the story, but God put on my heart deaf children in poverty. How many here have ever thought of deaf children in poverty? Now, I'm sure you're probably not going to raise your hand. I had not really even thought of deaf children in poverty, okay? My father hadn't. And I have some good friends that serve in the Compassion International organization, which they serve children in poverty and try to reach them for the gospel. And one thing led to another, and here we are. I'll spare you the story, but we started a ministry to deaf children in poverty. Does anybody know what this means here? Anybody know what this means? I love you. Very good. I'm married. No, I'm just joking. But this is I love you. I, in sign language, is this. This is L. This is Y. You put them together. I love you. And what we like to say with our logo is that if this is God's hand, he is holding the deaf world, deaf children specifically, in the palm of his hand, saying, I love you. So in a sense, for God, or John 3:16 is kind of what we think. God so loved the deaf world that he gave his only begotten son. So that's what our logo means. And whenever you look at our logo, and somebody said to me, well, does that mean that God's left-handed? I never thought about that before. But so that's what our logo means. But this is I love you in sign language. And that's why we have the deaf children. In a lot of our pictures, we have them hold up the I love you because it kind of sets us apart. A good way to explain what we do is we help deaf children in poverty. Not children, but we focus in on deaf children. And let's see if this works here. There we go. A lot of us have seen presentations about poverty, and I've built homes in Mexico for people in poverty. And poverty, I think the equation is poverty equals desperation. And I don't know if any of you have ever been in areas of the world where they just struggle to find food. It's desperate for people. It's desperate for parents who want to raise kids, sometimes just to find food. And we've seen maybe different presentations, missions coming through. But there's this one statistic here that really bothers me. More than 9 million children under the age of 5. So, what's your middle son's age again? 6. So under the age of 5, more than 6 million of these deaths are caused by malnutrition and are preventable. That ought to bother the church. The Big C church, that's if you can't feed your kids and they're going to die because of malnutrition, that's a desperate situation. God's thoughts on poverty in Jeremiah 22:16, he defended the cause of the poor and needy, and so all went well. Is that not what it means to know me, to know God, to defend the cause of the poor and needy? That's pretty strong there, isn't it? If we're Bible believers, God's speaking to us here. In Ezekiel, now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. Do you think here in America we're a little bit overfed? You know, I haven't missed a meal. I fasted one time for 24 hours. I don't think other than that few times that I've fasted, I've ever missed a meal. Are we unconcerned about that group that dies from malnutrition? They did not help the poor and needy. In James 1:27, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Wow, these scriptures hit me like a brick wall. I'm telling you, when I saw them. Helen Keller. We all learned about Helen Keller. Can you imagine being born blind and deaf? I cannot. I can't imagine being blind or imagine being deaf. And have you ever thought about which would you rather be, blind or deaf? Who knows? I don't know. But being born blind and deaf, that's just insane. But you know what? She ended up learning like 4 languages, 5 languages maybe. I know like English and sign language pretty well. My dad knows English, sign language, and Pig Latin pretty well. But you know, learning 5 languages, she was something else. But one of the things that she said, my blindness separates me from things, from material things. So if she got a new couch, she really didn't care what it looked like, you know. And if she got a new car, which she probably didn't, we wouldn't want her to drive, but she probably didn't care what it looked like. But she said, my deafness separates me from people. And have you ever thought about that before? That if you go on vacation, what are you going on vacation? I mean, how many people go on vacation alone? I don't know anybody. You go on vacation because you want to be with the people you love. You want to be with your friends, your family, your kids. And you don't want to just go and not talk to them, do you? You want to have fun with them. You want to share stories. You want to laugh together. You want to kid around. You want to talk. You want to communicate. But she said, my deafness separates me from people. It's that communication is so critical in our world. But deafness in poverty is interesting. And this blew me away when I started learning this. Over half of deaf children in poverty don't even know sign language. Okay? So you'd say to yourself, well, if you're deaf, your parents just teach you sign language, and you grow up signing to your friends and have a language, right? Guess what? 9 out of 10 deaf children all around the world are born to hearing parents. Does anybody have a deaf child in here? Okay, so it's not like when you're Japanese, guess what? Your kids, if the husband and wife are Japanese, most likely your child is going to be Japanese. I think all of us think that if you're deaf, it's deaf people have deaf kids, right? No. 9 out of 10 deaf children are born to hearing parents. And that 9 out of 10 parents have to start learning sign language to teach their child a language. What if you live in a developing country and you have no resource? You're a parent and you have a deaf child and you have no resources whatsoever to teach your child a language. Okay? That's why 50%, over 50%, so the majority of deaf children living in poverty have no language at all. So they have no way to communicate. They have no way to communicate, no education. What if you have no language? How are you going to be taught an education? Okay? So if you're deaf, here's a question for you all. If you're deaf, How many languages do you have to learn how to read? It's not a trick question. If you're deaf, 2. First, you have to be taught sign language. Okay? That's the first language you have to learn to be taught how to read. Then, through an educator, a teacher has to start teaching you how to read. But guess what? You have to learn how to read without sounding sounds out or syllables out or words out. So what's TH sound like? That's what your second grade teacher started teaching you. The. What's a C sound like? Ka or sa. What's a CH? It's cha. What's a A-E-I-O-U and consonants? T or W, wa. You have to start learning how to read without sounding words out. But first, you have to have a language. So in poverty, it is extremely difficult for a deaf child to get an education because there's not a whole lot of people that know sign language, are willing to take the time to teach you. And then guess what happens when you don't have a language? How are you going to learn about Jesus Christ and the love that he has for you and that he died for your sins? So if you're a deaf child in poverty, you often, with no language, you live in isolation, you're lonely, you're basically cast off and thought of as not worth educating. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you a video. It's of a boy in Uganda. And if we can make sure the volume is turned up, I'm going to turn this so they're very isolated. Here we go. This is
Patrick Otema is 15 years old. He was born deaf, but in this remote region of northern Uganda, there are no schools for deaf children. In his whole life, Patrick's never had a conversation.
Hello. I'm good.
His father, Charles, looks after him. They are only able to communicate through very basic gestures.
Cái lộc mà đó mà bắt cha lộc cái doga kita ku lộc ne paniang eto aramo tim mungkin mai ni nyaro wa yeno ko kwan ku cher porno aporo.
We've been sitting here talking about Patrick in front of him, and while he's been watching us, he doesn't understand what we're saying. It feels almost rude. But this is what Patrick's life is like all the time.
I'm here with someone who wants to change all that. Raymond Okello is deaf himself and a sign language teacher.
Do you think he could learn sign language? This is pretty much Patrick's existence. His father gestures to him what he wants him to do, and when he's finished, he goes back to his hut to spend the rest of the day on his own.
Patrick's fate is not unusual. The majority of deaf people in sub-Saharan Africa have never been taught sign language. Unable to communicate with others, they're trapped in their own minds. Raymond became deaf as a child after a bout of malaria. 6 months ago, he traveled to the capital for intensive training in sign language. Now he's returned to his village to do something unprecedented. He's going to teach the first sign language course ever set up here.
Raymond, are you nervous?
It's 2 o'clock. The first deaf students start turning up. And class begins.
The course has already started, but Patrick hasn't turned up yet, and I'm worried that his father couldn't convince him to leave home.
A few minutes later, Patrick arrives.
transformation is amazing. It's almost impossible to believe it's the same boy we met yesterday.
New deaf students keep arriving. Many have walked miles to be here. There's a 9-year-old boy and an 80-year-old woman. Before the end of the class, each new student goes to the front. The class votes on a new name for them. This is now Patrick's sign name, and he will use it for the rest of his life. He has just been baptized into a whole new world.
Isn't that something? The thing that struck me the most, almost from that video, well, a lot of things. What did it say there? An 80-year-old woman. So a woman who's gone 80 years without a language. Would that be isolating and lonely? And this is clapping in sign language. And so they gave Patrick a sign name and they clapped and said, this is your sign name. But this is a story of deaf children in poverty. Oh, again, over half of deaf children don't even have a language. And if you don't have a language, what's the Bible say about faith comes by what? Hearing. What if you can't hear? Again, deaf missions, a lot of you know of deaf missions. Deaf missions serves deaf people that have a language, okay? And they typically, ASL, American Sign Language, is the language that's used here in the States. And one of the questions I get a lot is, are there different sign languages in different countries? And the answer to that is absolutely. So if you're in Kenya, it's KSL, Kenyan Sign Language. It's different. So there's different sign languages for every country usually. But the new equation now is poverty plus deafness equals desperation plus isolation. And this is the group of children we serve because they are so isolated on top of being desperate, just like children in poverty. So according to the World Health Organization, and this is a number I didn't know until we started doing this, there are around 32 million deaf children in the entire world. Did anybody know this? I'm sure you guys knew this before I came, right? No. Okay, so this is all deaf children in the entire world. Okay? But 80% of deaf children are in developing countries. And you say, well, why is that, JD? Well, first off, there's a lot of developing countries, and there's a lot of people in those developing countries. But in the United States, 2 out of 1,000 people are born deaf. And that's another thing you're probably saying, oh, I already knew that, JD. No. It's 2 out of 1,000 people are born deaf in the United States. In developing countries in poverty areas, it's more like 3 or 4 or 5 deaf per 1,000. And then more people become deaf after they're born. And you'd say, well, why is that? It's because if you're in poverty, you have lack of nutrition. So the mother, while she's pregnant, is not eating very well. The mother, while she's pregnant, might get an illness and does not have good medical care, so the child becomes deaf in the womb. And then when the child is born, like the guy that was the sign language teacher, he had malaria, and that's why he became deaf. Well, how many people in the United States have malaria? None, because we have treatment in the United States. So there's more medical issues in developing countries. So it's almost 5 or 6 times the number of deaf people per capita in developing countries. So then you have these deaf children like Patrick there who are lonely, isolated. And what are the chances of you learning about the gospel if you have no language at all? Zilch. Zilch. How are you going to learn about Jesus without a language? So this breaks my heart. That's why I'm standing here on this stage today sharing this with you. That means there are approximately, and this is, you know, I think before I came, you might say, oh, there's probably a few thousand per country. There's 25 million deaf children living in poverty in developing countries. So this is the group of people that we're focusing on. Common challenges facing a deaf child. You might say, well, there's that language thing. Well, if you don't have a language, you're thought of as stupid. So, like, for example, in Uganda, they'll just say, oh, that's a Kasairu. And Kasairu means stupid in Uganda. And they'll say, that's some Kasairus over there. And that they'll just call them stupid. Or in Kenya, the word boo-boo means dumb. They'll just say, oh, that's a boo-boo, meaning deaf. Deaf children are not worth educating. This is so true in almost every developing country. Mexico, Kenya, a lot of these countries, they don't feel they're worth educating. Deaf children are sometimes sold like property. Even in Mexico, even as an adult deaf person, you have to have a legal guardian. And you're like property in Mexico if you're deaf. Deafness is a result of evil spirits or a generational curse from God, sometimes resulting in the deaf child being beaten. So there is a lot of weird belief systems in deaf developing countries. And so they feel like this child is deaf because there's a curse on them. And then that curse could affect the whole family, they think. And so deaf children are cast out of communities and taught. So Mother Teresa said, sometimes we think poverty is only being hungry, naked, and homeless. But the poverty of being unwanted, unloved, and uncared for is the greatest poverty. Wow. I always thought poverty was not having a meal, not having a place to stay, not having clothes. But the poverty of being unwanted and uncared for is the greatest poverty. And this is deaf children in poverty right there. Mother Teresa was often asked what she believed causes the greatest suffering. Anybody want to take a stab at that? What Mother Teresa thought was the greatest suffering. Anybody? Through your math? Loneliness. Yes. Wow. It makes you think of my parents are lonely without being able to see us right now. It's a suffering. In Matthew 25, Jesus said, whatever you do to the least of these, you do unto me. Whatever you don't do to the least of these, you don't do unto me. This used to bother me. How can Jesus say somebody is least? That means somebody else is most. That's classification. Then it occurred to me, it says right here, I was sick, in prison, needing clothes, thirsty. Those are all circumstances, aren't they? And it hit me. Nobody ever taught this to me, that this is not, when Jesus says the least of these, he's not talking about value, he's talking about circumstances. I feel that deaf children in poverty are the least of the least when you're talking about circumstances. Because remember, our new equation is desperation plus isolation, plus not even being wanted by your family, plus not even having a language to learn about Jesus. So, Deaf Child Hope International, we exist to provide hope to this group of children around the world. And the hope we provide, food and water, shelter, safety, love, care, and acceptance, medical attention, language of sign, educational opportunities, gospel of Jesus Christ. And this is what we try to focus on for deaf children in poverty around the world. And we serve currently deaf children in 11 countries. And this is some of the deaf children, and they're wearing our Deaf Child Hope t-shirt, which, by the way, I just happen to have some for sale here. They are $15, and they go with sport coats, they go with skirts, they go with slacks, jeans. You will be styling in one of these. And the most important thing is you'd be a billboard for helping deaf children in poverty. And I have sizes all the way from U small to adult 2X with me here today, if you're interested. But these deaf children in Ethiopia were not going to school before they were sponsored with Deaf Child Hope International. And now they're getting, on Wednesday nights, they're getting Bible teaching, and they're going to a deaf school. Mexico, some deaf children. These are all deaf children. Some of them are sponsored through us. The top right is Jonathan, and he was chained to a post. This is the first time he's getting shoes put on him. He's never had shoes before. He was chained to a post because they thought he was cursed. And those deaf children surrounding him, and they're all doing this. And it's because, like we've talked about, people believe in this voodoo. They believe some weird things in poverty areas. But this is Uganda, Liberia, and again, some of these children are already sponsored through us, and some aren't. Honduras, and we got one child sponsored in the USA in Cincinnati. Kenya, and we do serve. We operate an orphanage in Kenya called Lance's Deaf Orphans. The guy in the middle, on the bottom, is a deaf man from Colorado. He traveled to Kenya, and he learned that the deaf orphans in Kenya struggled mightily, and he started an orphanage. He turned it over to us about 5 years ago because it was too overwhelming for him. But these are all deaf orphans in Kenya, and we operate this. We send over $2,000 a month. Our director is Winston. He's a deaf man from Kenya. And I get texts from him. I just got a text yesterday, emails. And we operate this orphanage in Kenya, we partner with a lot of organizations to get their kids sponsored. And so that's how we do what we do. But we've sent money for bedding and for the kitchen. It's like if you remodeled your kitchen and it looked like this when you were done, would you guys like that for your kitchen? But this is their toilet. I was able to be over there. I need to go over again, but this is Winston and the staff at Lance's Deaf Orphans. And we were able to build, this is their campus. We hope to build a dorm this year for them with brick and mortar instead of this cheap tin. And we were able to put a well up for them in 2018. It might have been 2019. This is the pump. This was a $45,000 well, and now it supplies wonderful water for this group of orphans. So how can you help? You can pray, sponsor a deaf child in poverty. It's $38 a month, $1.25 a day. And the way you do that is we do have children on the back table, and you can take one of these home. I ask that you don't take one if you don't want to sponsor the child, but if you want to sponsor the child, you can take one. You can also go to our website, deafchildhope.org, and choose. We got probably a good 100 deaf children up on the site from 11 countries to serve. You can sponsor a deaf child teacher at $48 a month, and as you saw on the video, how important the teacher is of deaf children. Financially partner with us. We do need people to believe in us and just get behind us financially, just general finances. Like us on Facebook. And I ask people, if you could like us on Facebook and just share our post, that gets the word out. Buy and wear a Deaf Child Hope t-shirt and tell others about Deaf Child Hope and invite us to present at your church, which you've already done. So ways to sponsor: online, on your phone, with a card. Call us, email us, and that's my presentation. So it's so good to be here with you today, and I'm honored to be here, and thank you for listening. And if you could say a prayer for us and keep us in your mind, and I'll be in the back. You can take one of these newsletters on your way out if you're interested, and it's our latest one. So thank you.